All right, so I don't have that much time, and I've got some content to go through. So, who here uses Spotify? Anybody? Oh my God. Okay, that's perfect. Well, like Jonathan mentioned, my name's Peter. I'm talking about how we do personalization and recommendation at Spotify. And this is the slide where I usually say, who am I and why are you listening to me and blah, blah, blah. But he already did a great intro. I was once a TWGer many years ago in 2011, which is kind of crazy. That's like 7 years ago. And then also 2013, 2014, 2015, and all these other years. I'm now a senior recommendations engineer at Spotify in New York. And I just happen to be home for the week. So thank you all for having me. Okay, so Spotify, how do we do recommendations? How do we do things like Discover Weekly? How do we do the magic that makes it seem like we're in your head and we know what you want to listen to next? Well, if you talk to anybody who works in something like machine learning or some kinds of data science, they'll tell you that this is fundamentally what's called a ranking problem. Ranking doesn't really mean anything, but people in machine learning like to invent new words or use words in obtuse ways to make things confusing, because if things are confusing, they still have their jobs. So, no, I work with a lot of great ML engineers. Please don't show them this video. So ranking is this problem of we have all this content. We have these users on the platform. We have content like music and albums and artists and things like that. How do we rank them against each other in terms of some sort of similarity? So how do we say that this content is similar to this content, or this user would like this content, and so on? So this ranking problem really turns it into just make a list in order of how similar something is to something else. And with this, we can rank all sorts of different things. We can rank genres against users, against tracks and artists and albums and moods and playlists, and so many more things I can't put on this slide, but I wish I could. But with this kind of system and this kind of idea in mind, we can answer a lot of very fundamental questions that help do recommendations. So questions like, how much might a user like this content? Which you can think is kind of vital if you want to recommend content they're going to listen to in Discover Weekly or Daily Mix or Release Radar or whatever you have. This is the question number one that we try to answer. We can also answer other questions, like how similar is this content to other content? So we can compare two like random tracks on Spotify or random artists or albums and say these are similar or these are completely disparate and not related to each other at all. And extensions of this, we can say instead, which content is most similar to this content? So instead of comparing two things we know about, we can say, let's find in all the tracks on Spotify, all the millions and millions of tracks, which one is most similar to this? Or which one is most similar to this user or this artist and album and so on. You kind of get the picture. So other questions are like, which playlists are most similar to this user? So what do we show you on the homepage? Well, we can ask this question of our system, and we get back a list of playlists that you might want to listen to. And we also have things like, how can this content be clustered together? So the same kind of technology, but instead of ranking and telling you what's most popular for you or what will fit best, we can use the same technology to group things together and say, oh, all these tracks are similar, and so we'll make a playlist out of them. And all these tracks are similar, and we'll make a playlist out of those as well. So all of these are just questions in plain English, and it's not that hard to understand, but it takes a little bit of math. And I hope that you all remember your grade 12 math, because this is what we use to do all of our recommendations. This is, does anybody remember grade 12 math? Do you know what this is? Anybody want to shout it out? Slope, okay, some good suggestions there. A vector, someone said vector. This is a vector. I am my grade 12 math teacher right now. So we use this mathematical concept of a vector to do all of our recommendations. And how do we do that? Well, a vector encodes two things. It is the mathematical concept of having a magnitude or a distance between two things, and also a direction. So some notion that something is related to something else in a certain direction. So in this case, we could say this is a vector from this point 0, 0 to this point 1, 1, and there's a direction and there's a slope and whatever. But let's just assume for simplicity, all these vectors start at 0, 0. So we have this right here. Let's say this 1, 1 is a vector. Well, how does this help us with recommendations? It seems like I'm just going on a throwback to grade 12. Well, what this actually does is it allows us to compare things based on properties that we can give to tracks or artists or albums. So here's a graph. There's a vector right there in the middle, 1, 1. And let's give names to these axes. Let's say on the x-axis, this is how funky a track is. So does anybody know any funk music? Anybody want to shout out an artist for me?
Parliament.
Parliament, okay. So how funky is Parliament, Derek? Ultimately funky. So infinite on that graph? Okay, perfect. So at infinity we have Parliament. What is something that's not funky at all? Anybody? Kraftwerk. Okay, Kraftwerk, someone said Kraftwerk. Sure, so that's at 0 here. So we have this scale, and we can put all these tracks on this scale by this property of funkiness. Now let's pick another property for the y-axis. Let's say instead of funk, this is something close but not quite similar, or not quite the same, grooviness. So what's a groovy band? I'm gonna look at you again, Derek.
I don't have nothing for groovy.
Nothing for groovy. Anybody have something for groovy? Anderson .Paak. Oh, dude. You're on top of it. Okay, so Anderson .Paak is infinitely groovy at the top end of that scale there, and something that's not groovy, let's say Mozart is at the bottom there. So we've got a scale going from Mozart to Anderson .Paak, and we can take every single track on Spotify or anywhere really, and rate them according to these two factors, and say something here is more funky than something over here, and something here is more groovy, and so on. Then, if these are the only two dimensions we have to work with, we can just draw a circle. We can say that if you, your user, or your user on Spotify, are that point right there at 1, 1, then all the content in that vicinity right next to you is content you might want to listen to because it's similarly funky and similarly groovy. So it might be a little bit more funky than you usually listen to, but that's okay because it's close enough. So this could be a user in the middle and content they might like on the edges of this little boundary, or you can think of it slightly differently as maybe this is a track and this is a similar playlist close to that user as well, or basically any other thing like an album or an artist or whatever can go in there. So this is really just math. You could use a compass and a straight edge to figure this out. If you had all the tracks on Spotify on a big piece of paper, it would be a fairly large piece of paper. But we built a bunch of technology to do this. If you're curious and want to go on GitHub, we have a library called Annoy, not because it's annoying, but because it stands for Approximate Nearest Neighbors, Oh Yeah. That's really what that's really what it stands for. And this allows us to do these lookups in super, super fast time and powers all our recommendation stuff. Check that out. It's open source. It's kind of fun. So I went on that mathematical tangent for a second. Let's go back to these vectors here. We had funkiness and grooviness. What if we had songs that were neither funky nor groovy, but they still had other properties we wanted to compare? So rather than just, maybe it's Mozart and Bach. Someone's really into classical music. They're different, but they both have vectors of 0, 0, because they're both 0% funky and 0% groovy. Well, instead of 2 dimensions, let's look at this in a higher dimensional space. And this might blow your mind a little bit, but this is where we can't graph it anymore. This is where things get really confusing. Let's say we have an 8-dimensional vector. So x, y, z, and then all these other dimensions that you can only imagine when you're high on something or something, I don't know. We could give names to each of these dimensions. We could say that the first dimension is danceability, which is something we can predict with machine learning, energy, acousticness, valence, which is how happy or sad a track is, liveness, all these dimensions. We could put all these in here and then have a lot more information to do those nearest neighbor lookups. We could say, you like tracks that are 0.5 danceable and 0.75 energy and whatever, and then everything in the vicinity of those tracks would be stuff that we could recommend to you. And that would probably work okay. But we go one step further. That gives us these dimensions without telling us what they are. So it has some ability to cluster these things and to understand what's going on, but it can't tell us like, oh, this is the danceable, and this is the funk, and this is the groovy dimension and stuff like that. It just gives us these dimensions and these vectors. And this is actually what we do, and I'll talk about the algorithm in a second, but instead of using 8 dimensions, I'm going to blow your mind even more and go up to 40 dimensions, and that's what we use, and that's what that looks like. That's a real vector for whatever track I was listening to when I made this slide deck. But we don't know what any of these dimensions mean. Some of them might encode something like how poppy a song is or how rocky a song is. We don't really know. But also it doesn't matter that much because all we do is compare these vectors to other vectors. So how do we get these? Well, we use some off-the-shelf kind of magic software that came from Google called Word2Vec. Word2Vec is a confusingly named piece of software written by one Google engineer 10 years ago. It's open source. You can use it yourself. You can go on GitHub and download it. And it allows you to take, well, what it was originally made to do is you could take words or entire sentences and put them in, and then get vectors for each of those words. So words that were similar to each other would show up in similar areas of this vector space. And behind, that's a point cloud of a 3D rendering of our vector space as well. Instead of using words and instead of using sentences, what we do is we take playlists made by people on Spotify and we put them into Word2Vec. So each playlist has tracks on it and each sentence has words in it. So we just kind of map one to the other and we end up with an embedding of each of these tracks in 40 dimensions. So one of these is going to be a track and the other one next to it is going to be a track that's very similar to it and so on. So we learn by the wisdom of the crowd what's similar to what else. If you've heard of something called collaborative filtering, that's what this is. This is a fancy machine learning term. And if you've heard of machine learning in the first place, this is also machine learning. It's not fancy TensorFlow, something, Keras, ML. No, this is a simple way to do machine learning, and it's extremely effective, and it still powers a lot of our recommendations at Spotify. So there's one last thing I want to talk about, and that's if these are all tracks, that's great. I said we could rank tracks, albums, artists, users, and so on. How do we extrapolate from this to all the rest of our things on Spotify? And how do we give recommendations for you? You're not a track. Like, you're probably not a song. You're a human being. So Let's say we have these two users here, user A and user B. User A has listened to track 1, 2, 3, and 4. B has listened to 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, going back to high school math, these are vectors. We can basically just do arithmetic on the vectors. And so we use this very complicated algorithm called averaging to take the 4 vectors of the tracks this person's listened to and the 4 vectors of the tracks this person's listened to, put them all together, average them. And now this user is represented by a single vector. And we can do a lookup in that point of the space, and we get all the tracks that are similar to what they listened to, and ta-da, your Discover Weekly sounds pretty good. There's a lot more magic on top, but this is the fundamental principle that drives literally all the recommendations we do at Spotify. So with that, I am 30 seconds over time. I've got plenty of time for questions, though. Please hit me up with some questions, and thank you so much for having me.